All right, the time has come for the last session of the day. And again, we apologize that Nigel is not here, but the great news is that in half an hour, we managed to put together a top-level panel. These are incredible experts in the industry. I'm sure you know them already, but I want to reiterate that. And today, they're gonna talk about the future of open source. So who's in the panel? We have Paula Kennedy here. Welcome, Paula.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's go.
Hello.
Daniel Bryant.
Thanks.
Dan Lawrence.
Hello.
Thank you. Alex Chirkop. Welcome, Alex. And the panel is going to be moderated by the one and only Liz Rice. So Liz, over to you, and enjoy.
All right, thank you very much, Carla, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. So I have got a few seed questions to get us started, but I'm really hoping that this will start a discussion and you'll have lots of questions as well. So I will start kind of keeping my eye open pretty quickly for hands up if you have got questions. But let's start with a sort of simple question, I think. So Dan, in your talk this morning, you gave us a statistic about how 90% of the software that's running in the world today is open source. Does that mean we've reached peak open source? Let's start with you.
So the great part about statistics like that is that you can just make them up. I think that one came from the Sonatype State of the Software Supply Chain report, which showed somewhere between 90 to 98% based on who they surveyed and how they counted everything. So there's still some wiggle room there between 90 and 98% for it to grow. But at some point, we do still have to write our own code, and we have to add some value somewhere. So I don't know if this is peak open source, but it feels pretty good, the amount.
Daniel, what do you think?
Yeah, I kind of think it is peak open source. Just that I think like software writing is fundamentally changing without going into AI too much, because I appreciate it's not an AI panel. But I think like I've seen the rise of low code, no code, to your point, Dan, gluing things together. And arguably I've been doing that, like we've all been doing that for generations, right? With just like, for me, it was Java gluing stuff together. Now I'm not exactly sure what the code will look like. But I think increasingly we'll be plugging in these modules, plugging them together and actually delivering business value. And what does it look like in terms of the modules we're plugging together? I'm not sure if they'll be open source or will they be sort of like off the shelf from your platform, for example, that you may buy into. But I think in terms of like the wave many of us here have rode, like in our open source careers, right? I just get the feel with, I know we're going to dive into this, but with the pushback as a business model, and open source is not a business model, but as in like the open core business model, I think is sort of reaching perhaps the end of how we sort of know it at the moment.
Does it make sense to think of it as, you know, an iceberg with a, you know, the 10% that's proprietary kind of business value and the 90% that's
Yeah, and I guess one other comment there, it's less about the volume of open source, I think, in some ways, and it's more about the reuse that's happening. More and more open source is always going to get written, but there's only 100% in your application to go around. So I think what we're seeing is more reuse and more common components being used across all applications. It's less a thing of 10 million more GitHub repos on the CNCF landscape getting 100 times larger. It's more people settling on the same lines of code.
All right. So this week, HashiCorp CEO Dave McJannet. Now, for those of you who haven't already heard, HashiCorp recently moved from an open source license to the business software license for some of their code. Dave McJannet this week has predicted that there will be no more open source companies in Silicon Valley unless the community rethinks how it protects innovation. Paula, what are your thoughts on that?
Wow, okay, that's an interesting prediction. So my company, we founded 2 years ago. We are writing an open source framework, so our product is straight open source right now. Feels like, for us, that wasn't even I mean, obviously it was a decision, but it wasn't sort of a question of, well, should we or should we not go open source? It was first instinct, actually. And obviously we will be thinking about monetization, and we will have a strategy, and as we develop, and we'll end up with kind of an enterprise that we can get paid, because we need to get some money. It's not all for free. We talk about whether open source is a business model or not. Like, people get paid, right? We're not a charity, but for us, like, open source was always the first thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think someone's predicting that that's not going to be the future. I feel like that's nonsense. I feel like that's a little bit like one of those statements like DevOps is dead. I'm like, no, it's not really.
Yeah.
I feel like open source is also not. And it will just keep evolving, right? I think that's the thing. We may see lots of changes. We may see people coming up with different strategies, different licenses. But I think there's always going to be open source. There's such a community of people that want to have open source.
That makes sense. Alex?
So, open source is definitely not dead, and I think it's plainly bogus to say that foundations would have that effect. But I think open source and the ways it's used are evolving. I think what we see is in the past maybe people used to monetize open source in different ways, maybe through support, maybe through services, maybe through an open core with commercial add-ons. But I think what's changed and what's driving this schism recently is the consumption of software has changed. In many situations, the software is consumed as a service, and that fundamentally changes how you monetize it, because a lot of companies are trying to monetize by making it easy to run the service, and therefore, consumers consume it through that service. But of course, an open source service is very easy to copy, and we have very big cloud providers and very big service providers that will be all too happy to take that and not necessarily contribute anything back and use it, right? And then your business model goes away and you can't pay your developers. And that, I think, is the challenge that needs to evolve. I'm not suggesting there's an easy answer here. I think the Mongos of this world and the HashiCorps are struggling with this right now.
Although it's interesting that you use the word struggling, I don't know whether, Mongo has changed their license a long time ago. How's their business doing?
I think their business is doing really well. And companies like Mongo are, in fact, making the bulk of their revenue from their services now.
Dan, what's your thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. So I think
We've only got till past, so.
Sure. Yeah, so I think in particular, the business source license, the change that they made, and you mentioned Mongo as well, Mongo did a different one. They did the SSPL, or the server-side public license. The exact license matters here, and the Linux Foundation actually just put out a kind of response last night to kind of HashiCorp's strange accusations that foundations are ruining open source. But the business source license has a lot of problems where it's not actually a license. It's kind of like a license template, and you have to fill in this section in the middle that says, it's free to use for everyone except for whatever we fill in here. And one of the reasons open source has done so well and has grown so virally and everything is that companies and OSPOs have kind of enabled its usage now because we understand the licenses and we know what Apache means, we know what MIT means. Lawyers are now comfortable with developers just grabbing code and using it as long as it meets those licenses. If we start getting fragmentation there again and every project with its own BUSL is very different, developers are going to have to start going to ask their lawyers for every single package that they bring back in. I know developers hate talking to salespeople. I think they hate talking to lawyers even more. And so this is the type of thing that works for one or two companies here and there that have enough distribution that people will actually go and figure out if they're allowed to use these packages with these custom licenses. But it's not a model that scales. It's not a model where everyone is going to have their own version of the BUSL and every lawyer is going to have to bill hourly to go review each one of these.
I think that custom license is the moat. It actually stops people using the software. I think, if my team is looking at what bits of software they incorporate in a stack, if it's not a clear license, I'm not going to waste the time speaking to a lawyer. It's just too much hard work.
I think that's a really interesting point because the logical extension of that is that a startup will start by writing open source software and can't start with a custom license, a business software license with a custom extract in it, which suggests that all of us, if we want to start a startup, are going to go through this step of changing our license. And then, is that changing a social contract? Is that an okay thing to do? Paula, what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's something we're going to learn, right? But is it changing the social contract? Maybe. I feel like maybe that's the backlash that HashiCorp have faced is because people feel emotion. Like a lot of people are using Terraform. A lot of people, right? And people felt like it was open source forever. It's always been open source, therefore it's always going to be open source. And now they've changed the license. And it almost feels like personal, like, oh, I've actually been betrayed and this is my thing I was using and now I have to worry about it more. So maybe it's a change in social contract. I feel like it feels like it. But on the other hand, like I say, I can understand the reason why. I mean, the HashiCorp need people to kind of pay for that software, and they're facing the challenges that Alex mentioned, right? People are trying to big cloud providers, big service providers, they can come in, take the open source, they are then making money off of it, which also doesn't feel great.
Yeah, and the business has the right and potentially responsibility to its employees and its shareholders to protect their own business model. So maybe the ethics are not very clearly on one side of this equation. It's a balance. Yeah. Daniel, your thoughts?
Yeah, one thing, I think you hit the nail on the head, Paula, and we sort of got used to we're going to pitch the code and it's part of a community effort, right? I think that's what a lot of us growing up. And I love HashiCorp. I'm actually a HashiCorp ambassador, just to share that one as a disclaimer. But I think the tricky thing is, thanks, Dan. I think the tricky thing is that I sort of grew up in the OpenJDK Java space, right? And I signed a contributors agreement when I contributed code to OpenJDK, knowing I was giving up my sort of rights on that code, right? And in fairness, the Oracle folks, they really drilled that into us. Like, you are giving up your rights. It's a commercial. We're going to commercialize some part of this product, right? And I went in eyes open. I was still happy to be part of the community because there was so many benefits for me to be part of OpenJDK. I think even though HashiCorp made folks sign a contributor agreement, so it was there, legally they're covered, a lot of folks were like, oh, they won't enforce it, or oh, it's not important, I'm still part of a bigger thing. So I think that's the tricky thing. We sort of got used to we're being part of a bigger community, and when sort of it is a little bit of a rug pull, subjectively, right? And legally they're covered, even maybe from an ethics business point, they might be covered, but it feels kind of different, right? And a lot of folks, it's their first time in open source where that's happened to them. For us sort of greybeards that haven't been, we've been around a while and seen some of this before, we're like, fair enough, got to make some money. I totally get it. I'm a capitalist at heart, right? But I think for folks that are newer to this space, it's like a big shock.
Yeah. So does that mean businesses need to do more to kind of communicate with their communities what it means when they sign a CLA or some other contributor agreement?
Yeah, I think HashiCorp was completely in the rights to do this. It was always HashiCorp/fault. There was never any indication that this was a community-run project. They've always been incredibly clear. They'd reject pull requests that compete with them, and that's completely fine. But you see a lot of other cases, though, where projects are under governance theater and they look more like they're community-driven projects, but really they're part of a business. And I guess there's a couple questions to it. One is the HashiCorp case, and then one is that the future of open source, which I think Dave was also arguing that we're going to see this more and more often.
Let's get a little show of hands as well. Before I see a question coming. Show of hands, how many people in the room think that HashiCorp did the wrong thing by changing their license? Quite a few hands. Yeah, and would the rest of you, how many of you would say, no, I would defend their right to do that? I think they've done a sensible thing. Pretty even split, actually. Yeah.
I guess a better question is how many people are planning to switch to Open Tofu?
Great question.
Only a few.
Yeah.
I mean,
Matt, go ahead.
Kind of leads into where the interesting, meat is in this question. Really, is about what we've seen so far is companies who started out in open core switching into a restrictive license because that was somehow impacting on their business model, but and they can say all they like about well this is going to impact on the future of open source, but we've yet to see any closed source entrance into spaces which are dominated by open source, and really what spaces are not dominated by open source now, right? And so if that is true, you would expect to see successful closed source companies entering into the database space, entering into operating systems, entering into all the spaces where, for anybody who's old enough to remember what the pre-Linux world was like, everything was proprietary. So and I struggle to see how that pure commercial, pure closed source play will play out with enterprises in the modern world where, we're consuming absolutely everything as open source.
I would flag up that particularly in the security world, there's still quite a lot of proprietary solutions out there. So I don't think it would be fair to say that enterprises blanket have stopped using proprietary
I mean,
software.
I guess I should caveat that a bit because what I'm talking about, those tend to not be things that people are consuming as part of a stack that they're building on top of. I mean, security tools tend to be more a thing I'm buying to do a specific job, as opposed to I'm going to integrate that and build something on top of it or whatever.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. The thing that's been very prevalent over the last decade or so has been that in order to get developers to use your software, and if your audience is the developer community, then you kind of need to be open source. And that has evolved into, a variety of product-led growth templates and DevRel and all of this sort of thing, which does actually turn open source into almost a marketing tool. And here's the thing, I think developers look at open source and they say, well, it's open, so I can trust it. Maybe naively thinking that this company is doing it for everybody's benefit, but actually the company is doing it for some sort of monetary benefit at some point. But because they're doing it because of that trust, when there's a change, then it's a betrayal. And that smarts. And I think this is actually, I was just having this conversation the other day with a group of my team and suggesting, we probably actually want to focus on software that comes from foundations because there is a certain amount of IP protection and, a longer-term roadmap for the key things in your stack anyway.
Yeah, so that brings us on to the role of foundations. I mean, Paula, what's your thoughts about foundation-based software? Should people all be contributing only to foundation-owned software?
I mean, I'm a big fan of foundations in general, but I think for us, our open source project is not in the CNCF right now, right? We're still kind of early days, but when we're talking to customers, we get asked, what are you going to do with it? Is it going to go into a foundation? And it's absolutely our intention for the reasons that Alex just enumerated, right? Like the IP protection, the fact that it feels more kind of governed and people trust it. So for us, we have a path we want to get into, kind of CNCF into Sandbox. That's our plan. It's just for us, it's just a question of when, but it's not a question of if. It's for us, it's for sure we want to go into the foundation because we want to feel that support, we want to be part of that community, and we know that our customers will value the fact that it's protected, the IP is there, and it's in that foundation.
Yeah. And do you think that having the software in a foundation will enable, encourage other organizations to contribute to that project, and would that be a good thing?
I hope so. I mean, I think you talked about having kind of contributor license agreements. So right now, our product's on, it's on GitHub. People can make pull requests. We'd welcome contributions if you want to give us any feedback. But I hope so as well. Yeah, that's one of the benefits, right? It can go on there. We might end up as a small dot on the CNCF landscape because it's very big. But there's certainly benefits of being part of that community, and that could be one of them. We can then go to the KubeCons and talk about people contributing, and we're right there with the whole 10,000 developers that we can, talk to and interact with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think from Cilium Project's perspective, it's been hugely valuable to be able to talk about Cilium in the context of that kind of stamp of approval of CNCF, the audience, the integration points, the kind of community acceptance. There's a lot of power in the foundation kind of community around that, for sure.
Risk mitigation, I think, as well, isn't it? So I led 2 projects going into CNCF with Ambassador Labs, and the reason we did that, as Paul was saying, a lot of folks are like, if you're the sort of sole owner, we're not sure exactly what you do. You good intentions at the moment, right? But once you give up that IP, we're like, we'll buy into the product more, and we're happy to contribute more. So the 2 projects, but one in sandbox and one in incubation level. And there's a lot of due diligence involved as well in terms of not only your code, but the processes you put around it. And they do weed out all the maintainers are from Ambassador Labs. Hang on. So you have to diversify your maintainers as an example. And it was actually all just good practices, but it forced us as a business to really think about how we're going to run this project going forward. And our customers and our community users loved it.
Well, I think it's important to frame that risk mitigation piece a little bit too and talk about exactly what license changes mean and what foundations can actually protect against. HashiCorp can't and didn't go and retroactively change the licenses of all of the old releases. They just changed the licenses for new releases going forward. Foundations can protect against that, but if a project ends up abandoned with only one company maintaining it anyway, even if it's part of a foundation, they could just fork it and start contributing somewhere else. The foundation can't force the project to stay healthy. You can't force the project to continue on forever. That requires something different. What foundations really protect against here is the trademark. They own that trademark. And that's why the OpenTofu project had to go do a whole bunch of renaming work to get Terraform out of any of the names anywhere. That's the trademark piece. They were still able to fork and continue even though they weren't in a foundation before because all of that software was still available under that old license. So foundations can't guarantee their project is going to stay around forever. They can just really help with that trademark and IP protection piece, which isn't nothing, but it is still important to kind of put it in context.
Do we have some other questions from the audience yet? Yes, I see a few down here. Yes.
So I'm curious, we've touched on the financial implications, but we haven't really spoken about innovation. So to bring up what you've said about it being a marketing tool, I would argue actually it's an incubator. So there was a wonderful talk by someone whose name escapes me about the history of containers and how we've come to be where we are. I would argue that with open source, if you were to remove that, okay, yeah, companies will make lots of money, but we might not see as much innovation. Most people in the room probably are here because they like technology and they like innovating. So could somebody comment on that angle and whether they agree or not?
I definitely agree with that. I think I've seen more innovation through open source. But the difficult thing is you can't really tell because you don't know what's happening in the proprietary world until it reaches the light of day.
Yeah, I think to try to play David McJanet's advocate here, I think his argument in that post was that if these startups can't sustain themselves, if they can't make money, then they can't innovate either. But that's a big difference in sustainability and my business sustainability versus sustainability of the entire open source ecosystem. And I think we have seen decades and decades of history of open source sustaining through stuff like this. Even when companies go out of business, if it's useful, someone else will pick it up. So I completely agree.
It's been interesting. One thing I've observed recently is a few months ago, like maybe April time, some folks in my team drafted together what we called a platform maturity model. Because we're like platform engineering is kind of where we're at, and we were like, what does a good platform look like? So we drafted something, and then we're like, do you know what? The only way this is going to be good is if we actually get lots and lots of people and lots of ideas. And so we just gave our first draft to the CNCF, and then that has been adopted into the platform working group, which is under the TAG application team, and it's evolved, and it's like so much better, and it's that power of kind of like everybody building on top of each other, and therefore not software innovation, but like the innovation of ideas of like how to make this model better has come straight through from that foundation and that collaboration. And maybe sometimes if you've got that kind of open source kind of governance model, maybe decisions are slower sometimes if you've got lots of people you're trying to wrangle. But I think for innovation, absolutely having lots and lots of people to be able to contribute is where innovation can come from.
That does make me think of Docker and the way that, they were doing everything open source, but they weren't going to wait for everybody to agree with them, and it was specification by kind of writing the code and building a thing, and if people use it, then that becomes de facto the spec. And I think that probably is a better way of driving innovation than everybody sitting in a room and trying to agree, because it just takes forever.
In an ideal world, there would be some correlation between innovation and making money. But, that recipe...
Capitalism, eh?
Well, but that recipe doesn't actually exist, right? There have been... Docker is a perfect example of, an extreme amount of innovation, and it's taken them a long, long time to get to that point where they can actually make money out of it. But I think we we need to, there will always be winners and losers. And I think the things that drive these discussions are when you have egregious winners and losers, where something is seen to be just unfair, right? And when we saw, like, a couple of years back, a suite of companies, Redis, Mongo, a bunch of others, changed their licensing, it was because there was a change in the way that those softwares were being consumed. And it wasn't, to put it into perspective, because I've spoken to some of those founders and I've spoken to some of those companies and VCs that funded them, the services companies that were making money off them, it wasn't, a 6-figure sum, it wasn't a 7-figure sum, not even an 8 or a 9, it was a 10-figure sum, right? That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that's being percolated at the top and not kind of going out to the community again. And I kind of wonder whether we need some sort of contract here to make sure that the innovation continues to happen and that the right people who are contributing that innovation are actually funded appropriately. One of the analogies I mentioned once was, think about the food industry. The restaurant that sells you a plate of pasta is making a lot of money compared to the farmer that's actually growing the food and making the food in the first place. And somehow we kind of said, oh, but you know what, food is really important. We're going to subsidize the farmers. And that was probably the right call to do because we don't want to be hungry. And we probably need to do exactly the same thing to continue to foster the innovation in the open source business in some sort of way.
Interesting. There were definitely some more questions down here. Yeah. Oh.
There's been a lot of talk about foundations, and particularly the CNCF, but there are quite a lot of foundations out there. Like I know SigStore is part of a different one. There's the OpenCD Foundation. I know there's a Rust Foundation, which isn't LF associated at all. Do we have too many foundations, or is a distinction between them useful?
Are we at peak foundation?
Somebody should do a foundation landscape.
I did hear someone say that the Linux Foundation has built a foundation as a service, practically, at this point.
Yeah, I think like anything else, a bit of competition is probably good, and the fact that not all foundations live under the Linux Foundation probably means there's a bit of competition and a bit of, yeah, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, +1. I think the danger is when they start sort of playing off against each other, because like somewhat foundations are a marketing or lobbying organization as well. And I think where the money goes, you look at what the CNCF charges to be part of, like if you're a silver or platinum member, it's quite expensive. So that is the danger. That where did the dollars end up? Because you're putting a lot of cash, potential pounds. Sorry, I'm in the UK. Where does the money end up? That money could be funding other things. And suddenly, if you get more and more foundations popping up, you're putting more and more cash into all these different foundations to be a member. When I was running DevRel, spending X dollars on being a silver member of the CNCF was something I had to weigh up. And I was like, do we then also sponsor the different foundation? To your question, James, I was like, I can only really afford one foundation. So if there's more and more foundations emerging, I think that was as a kind of with my business hat on, I'd be like, it's like peanut butter. You're spreading it way too thin, right? All the cash I've got. So I think I like a bit of competition, but not too many, where it becomes like where do I put the bets?
I have heard people from very large software companies complaining a bit that, sometimes it feels like they're creating more foundations just to have an excuse to charge another 6-figure sum from our foundation budget. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have a technical question around the Terraform license changes. Terraform 1.6 will have the new license, which is somewhat problematic. OpenTofu has a nice license. So in 6 months' time, how would the vendors of both of those projects go about copying features? Because people don't ask for that.
So I think the question was the new release of Terraform 1.6 has the new license, the BUSL one. OpenTofu has the old MPL one. In 6 months, how are they going to compare? Is that roughly it?
they will have a diverging feature set eventually, right? So how would copying features go? Because people will ask for that, and somebody needs to give a good answer.
Yeah, I think this is a really unique one where I think normally when you see something like this, say the last similar case I saw was like Elasticsearch and OpenSearch, where they forked. There's the OpenSearch license stayed what it was. The feature sets haven't diverged that much. My prediction is that there's going to be a lot more divergence here, just because the contributor base to Terraform has kind of been starved for a while. There have been a lot of rejected PRs that would have added features that HashiCorp rejected because they would compete with HashiCorp. So we don't have to wait a while to see what that divergence is going to be. You can look back at the last multiple years and find PRs that passed tests and were ready to go that people are eager to queue up right now without having that gate. So I think the divergence is going to happen a lot faster here, and it is going to harm users in the short term as they have to figure out which to use. But I think in the long term, you're going to have two projects that meet the needs of different people a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I perhaps have one. I think like there's going to be the HashiCorp like sort of cloud offering, which is like I know a lot of people use already, and I imagine there's going to be satellites around that because I've seen this a little bit in the Java space where vendors will want to compete to add their own secret spice on this. So there'll be open tofu, but people might put their own stuff on it as well. So you get even more divergence there. And I'm with Dan as in like I don't actually know what it's going to look like, but I think it's going to be more confusing if I'm being honest.
Terraform is a particularly pernickety system, simply because most of the benefits of Terraform is all of the providers, which are essentially mostly community-driven or very community-driven. So I don't know where the community is going to go. It might stay, it might go, and it's probably going to be a mix.
Yeah, on that point, it is worth just saying like, a lot of the providers are going to be still open, as in Apache license, right? I think
MPL.
Yeah. So that's just as in because like that. Totally fair point, Alex. Like that is the crux or the core, if you like, of Terraform. So there is a split between sort of the product and the contributions with the modules, the plugins. As well worth investigating that if you're looking into that.
And I imagine for the people who are maintaining those plugins, who are community people or not part of HashiCorp or the OpenTofu founding companies, that kind of third-party set of maintainers will have to think about. I think it won't be in anybody's interest for those interfaces to diverge, because otherwise they'd have to make a decision about which ones to support, and who knows which way that'll go.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to happen at some point as they innovate. Eventually, there's going to be some proposal that's going to require some interface change, and you're going to have to make a hard decision.
Two more questions.
Okay.
On the large company matter of supporting open source, I worked at some large places, and they'd often look at open source either as something they could take advantage of, or kind of a free handout, and often they would use a lot of open source libraries, and they'd very carefully vet the licenses and make sure there was no exposure, and they weren't really keen to give back to open source unless it was in the form of a support contract that they absolutely needed to purchase, whilst at the same time developing a lot of IP in-house that would be suitable for open sourcing, and yet not feeling the need to contribute it, even if it would kind of support their company going forward, which shows that a lot of large companies don't really understand the benefits they could get from open source. Is there a way that we can encourage large companies to give back to the community and also support open source developers in a more kind of favorable way, rather than just looking to purchase support contracts?
Yeah, I think that's something that organisations, certainly the CNCF, has tried quite hard through its end user organisation to encourage people to understand more about the benefits of making contributions and making those contributions upstream rather than having their own forks and trying to maintain that going forward. I don't know if there are similar.
I mean, we've got in the UK, we've got Open UK, which is a sort of a non-profit organisation that is trying to convince government and companies of the benefits of open source, basically, and not just software. It's open software, open data, and hardware.
Hardware, yeah.
So if you haven't heard of Open UK, look it up. They're doing a big conference next year, February, I think.
February 6th and 7th, I think it is.
I think Liz is on the board, are you?
Yeah, I am on the board of Open UK, yes. We need to give a shout out to that. State of Open Con. I think this kind of conversation will continue to run and run there. So yeah,
that's one of the things they're trying to help with is like help governments to think about, like help UK Gov to think about their open source policy, help companies to think about their open source policy. Like it's one of the driving forces, right?
One more question, yeah?
Last one.
I have no question. It's a comment about the license change. I'm a HashiCorp ambassador, but I think they made a bad decision to changing the license because, as you said, is a pick of open source. It's not pick of open source, but the words get changed. And it means behind any open source application, there are a couple of big companies as a customer, as a contributor, and if you provide some service, some tools in an open source way, and after a while you come to the picture and say, okay, I want to change my license, the community, because the community has more power, always doesn't matter your company, how much big your company, how much money you have in your company, it's a rule. The community and the people has more power, and they fork it and they create something new. It is we saw in the journey of the open source. For example, I think in HashiCorp they didn't learn from the what really happened in the past. For example, Red Hat said, okay, we don't continue CentOS, and the community said, okay, doesnent matter. We fork it, created Rocky Linux, Alma Linux. What happened to the MySQL? They created the MariaDB, and this way will be continued. And every time you try, as a company, try to change your license, community will fork it and create a new open source version.
I'm going to say that there are cases on both sides of that argument, because the flip side of this is, the number of people who said when Elastic changed their license, oh, they're doomed. That's them dead, and they're not. And MongoDB the same. I think there are examples on both. Where it's been successful. Perhaps it's been the thing that was necessary for the company to continue to exist. I don't know. Your thoughts?
You're 100% right. There are definitely people that have won on both sides of that argument, and I don't think it's a given. I think the 90% open source thing is the fact that it doesn't matter what you build. Your compilers are open source, your operating system is open source, your orchestrator, your schedulers, your message bus, your databases are likely open source nowadays.
Windows isn't open source.
Well, sure, and how many cloud instances run on Windows, right? But the thing is, I think if something has a value and it sits well in a stack and it's got enough critical mass that there's an ecosystem around it, it's not going to go anywhere, unfortunately, even if the license has changed. And the reality is, I think we kind of all owe it to ourselves to take a step back and just figure out what the impact of the license change actually is. Because in some cases, maybe it makes, for the 5 companies that actually compete with HashiCorp, yeah, that's actually a deal breaker. They're wondering, their shareholders are wondering, where do we go from here? For the 99.9% of other users, maybe it hasn't had actually that much of an effect. So will it actually change Terraform? Probably not. As frustrating as that is, right?
Closing thoughts, maybe. Paula, do you have anything you want to?
I mean, I will restate that I think open source is not dead. Long live open source.
Rumours of open source deaths are greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Can I perhaps wrap up sort of in response to Jent's question about I think both those point on the question. Be the change you want to see in the world, right? So if you're a company and you drive the contributions back to open source, that kind of thing, right? I think I'd say the same thing with the HashiCorp thing, because I know Armon, I know Mitchell, and they're really smart people and they really care about the community. I can only imagine there's really tense board conversations involved. How are we going to hit these numbers? What we're going to do? I'm sure they deliberate it over many nights. I've seen some of that at Ambassador Labs and other companies I've worked at, other startups. So yeah, be the change you want to see, and always assume good intent, because even though we may not like the results of some of these things, I do a lot of the time assume good intent from folks, but we can always help by educating folks and being the change we want to see, right?
Yeah, I think I'll just wrap by saying open source, it's not dead, like you said. Open source business model, open source is not a business model, but it can still be part of business strategies. That's not dead either. Open source business strategies have gotten harder, but so have every business strategy in the last few years. So I think you're just going to see more scrutiny and more planning and more strategy early on with this. As a function of the economy, everyone is doing this. You can't just get a bunch of GitHub stars and then be worth billions of dollars anymore. You need a step 2 in that plan beyond release open source, make money.
I'm just going to say one thing. I'm just thankful to be part of the open source community, and I'm just thankful for all the people in this room, thankful for all the people that help, make everything we do possible, because that is the real open source, and we might be seeing lots of changes, and change is always there. But it's here to stay, and I'm thankful that we have the opportunity to live in this sort of world.
Very well said. I think wrapping that up, I'll say thank you to KCD for letting us have this conversation today. As Paula mentioned, Open UK is really interested in this conversation and how this develops going forward. So do keep an eye out for State of OpenCon, because I think this conversation will run and run.
Oh, yeah.
Meetup, Open UK meetup as well.
There's a meetup as well. Okay,
Next 24th, next week.
Fantastic, good. I'll let you plug that.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all panelists here. Round of applause, please.